those kinds of things. So um, some of these I'll go over quickly. Some of these and so we, as I mentioned, we talked about who Caudillos were, and these are military, political, populist, personalist leaders. And when we talk about personalists, we're talking about individuals who are not necessarily, it's almost like they have their personal charisma. If you think about what has gone on in this country for the past maybe 5 6 years, it's almost like um, the tenets that made certain political parties are no longer important. Now it's almost like if a certain leader says something, that's what that particular party does. So, for example, if he says we are not going to help allies, and so, for example, Republicans are thought to be very strong on national security, but if he says forget alliances, everybody's like, yeah, forget alliances. So this is the personalist kind of leaders, except in Latin America, a lot of them were military. They had significant military and political power. So the only maybe difference is that in the US, military power is not, well, the president is a commander in chief. They are rarely, in fact, there are very few leaders who have been military leaders or generals. George W. Bush was pilot. Um, I don't think Mr. Biden served in any military capacity. Mr. Trump did not. And so this is one of those differences. But so we talked about how this is akin to a dictator, very prevalent in Latin America, particularly after independence. And we'll see why this was the case. But so Caudillos were often Creoles. And so Creoles is often presented in two ways: Creole, Creole, or Criollos. And so you can sort of see these Creoles who are Caudillos. These things are sort of they combine. And if you think about people like Jose San Martin, Santa Anna, Simon Bolivar, all these were both Caudillos and Creoles. Um, and so we also talked about who was what. So Simon Bolivar, De Sucre, Jose San Martin, O'Higgins, and quite a number of others were Creoles. So Spanish descent, born in the Spanish Americas. Now, this statement, I think, kind of does encapsulate what the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico and much of Latin America. And again, this was from one of those Creoles, Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz was elected president of Mexico for about 4 terms of 6 years. So he was in power for about 30 something years. Again, these are leaders who ruled for very long. If you think about Cuba and the Castros were in power for about 60 years. So it's in this tradition of really long lasting leaders. And so Porfirio Diaz was another Creole, but he was actually overthrown. There were elections and he presided over some of the most productive years of Mexico industrialization and so on. And so we briefly talked about some of the challenges that were in Latin America. So when we talk about European countries, for example, and if you actually compare Brazil and Portugal, you will see the size differences are really, really significant. But so European nations were small, so was the US, so the 13 colonies were just, But when you think about Latin America, if you think of Brazil, if you think of Peru, Argentina. These were really huge countries, and this is we are talking about the 1800s, so there wasn't modern infrastructure. But even when there was modern infrastructure, there wasn't really the ability to navigate. So there are very few rivers. The rivers that are there, other than the Amazon, have falls and are not easily navigable. And so it was very difficult to control the um, the the whole country. In fact, you find a lot of distinctions between the cities and the rural areas. So the Spaniards kind of controlled the business capitals, the ports, the administrative centers. But the highlands and the interior was very sort of loosely controlled. And so it's almost like there was no real connection. And often you can see that reproduced today. So, for example, in Amazonia in Brazil, that's where the rainforests are. That's where including uncontacted people. So it's not even too much out of the realm of modernity. So it was very difficult to control territory. There were many uprisings, revolts. It was difficult to collect taxes. And again, colonialists mostly were in cities and towns and mining camps, and even the administration by necessity became sort of a hybrid affair. You control the indigenous people through their representatives, indigenous, mixed race. And so it's the, the challenge with this is that you do not see um, the centralized states take hold. So it's almost like these loose collections of territories with limited interactions and an imagined sense of what they are. And so it was more negotiation than coercion because, you know, as we mentioned, the Spaniards sent troops into the mountains and most of those sites. So how do you, um, yeah, so size and physical obstacles like mountain ranges and gorges and jungles were helpful to the natives, but challenging to the colonialists. And so the even the people who were nominally told they were under the Spaniards, they are like, well, we don't see any Spaniards around here, so how do they again maybe control us? But even more interestingly was the fact that colonialism, by definition, was oppressive. And so, if you are not interacting with the institutions of colonialism, why would you obey them? And again, the Spaniards were often seen as these oppressors. And even though we talked about the interesting dynamic between colonialists and the people they colonized, um, so for example, the indigenous peoples would be more aligned with colonialists because that way they had more um, freedoms and they could control their villages and so on. Um, it's sort of yeah we see that we still maintain our own way of life and our leaderships and our villages and our land, but you're still the oppressors. You're coming in to take our stuff, and we kind of don't like it. And so you see the emperor. Um, so the two major symbols of colonialism were the emperor and his, governors and other officials, and the Catholic Church. Um, but this actually brings in a very unusual relationship because Latin America is very religious. People are very religiously observant. So it's almost like the colonialists came together with their religion, but now we are into this religion. And in fact, you find this in many places that were colonized, in places like Africa. You see the uptake of religion, even though you do not like the person who is bringing the religion to you. And so the Spanish king was seen often as and almost because he was so distant, but he'd also often intervene in fair ways. So he was seen as the more benign, while the colonial officials were seen as the more out of control. And so the king did often intervene in local land disputes, removing corrupt officials. And again, you know, the colonialists were working for the king, so that could be arranged. The king could offer pardons for crimes. And again, if you compare this with what was happening in the US during the revolution, this is precisely what the King of England could do. They could, you know, intervene in disputes, remove officials. Now, the church, on the other hand, ministered to the poor. They shaped the ceremonial life. So, particularly the Catholic Church, when you think of the seven sacraments, from birth, baptism, sacraments, death, naming, and so on. So the church was in every aspect of everybody's life, particularly those who are believers. And so you can sort of begin to think about how these institutions are in place and in charge for about 300 years. So from about 1500 to about 1830s. And suddenly independence comes, and it's, you know, the king is no longer there, there's independence. And so who is going to be now in charge? Again, remember the rural areas were mostly indigenous peoples. To some extent, there were the enslaved Africans. And so it's almost like there's this vacuum of control. And we are going to see Latin America experience these vacuums that were filled by a whole different different groups of people. So the indigenous would try to step into the gap. The enslaved would try to, now the formerly enslaved would try to step in and try to assert various types of rights. And so but the point is that there was this, after independence, it wasn't clear who was in charge. It wasn't clear that even those who say they were in charge were actually in charge. And so this is where the Caudillo steps in. The Caudillo has a link to the colonial past because of the racial structure. So again, you have the Peninsulares, you have then the mostly the Caudillos who are born in New Spain, and then you have mestizos, mulattoes, and or other different groups of people. And so it's almost like they are stepping into this bridge, this gap that colonialism has left. But there's also very specific attributes that Caudillos have. So among the qualities that sometimes seem to distinguish them, physically strong with an air of invisibility. So, you know, like they exuded this, and maybe we should introduce this term, machismo. So the masculine, some people might call it toxic masculinity, but so the idea of a physically strong, invincible male. But the Caudillos actually then begin to step into the gap that is left by colonialism and provide the same services, connecting to their followers, settling grievances, defending followers, just the king, like the king did. But their power was often regional, so it wasn't as much as perhaps the king. And they had different mechanisms to rule. So some of them recruited armies. Now, the armies that they recruited were often personally loyal to them. So again, it's not like they are creating a nation, they are creating armies that are loyal to them. Now, the problem is that if you are loyal to an individual, if that individual is no longer there, then what happens? And then they also had informal networks of patronage. So they would extend certain benefits, appoint people, officials here and there, allow them to collect taxes. And so these networks persisted. Now, this is what we think of as perhaps maybe nepotism today. Actually, if you think about the United States, it kind of ran on this system until, in fact, McKinley and who was the other, Garfield, were assassinated by individuals who thought that they deserved like appointments. One wanted appointment to France as an ambassador because they thought that they were in these patronage systems. Um, and so again, patronage was not, but these Caudillos were not doing something that wasn't being done. That was sort of the system at that time. It's just that it was detrimental. Um, and so we see them presiding over this period of time when there's a lot of territorial shift. We talked about Santa Anna and his 11 times being in charge of Mexico when Mexico lost half of its territory to the US and lost some more territory to Central America. Um, so if you sort of think about the juxtaposition of these Caudillos, like you're the successor to the colonial empire, but you are losing most of your territory and your loyalties are personal, and so this sort of juxtaposition of they are ruling, but they really are sort of presiding over disintegrating empires. So further south, we see Chile and Peru and Bolivia. And so Peru and Bolivia were actually two of the Spanish crown jewels, really wealthy. In fact, the only other place that was probably more wealthy was actually, yes, Peru and Bolivia were the wealthiest. And there was a stable oligarchy. So part of the reason that these were so wealthy was um, the mining. Now, again, it's useful to connect Latin American developments to other areas of the world. For example, um, the Spaniards were trading a lot with the rest of the world. After all, that is why people like Magellan and Cortez were looking for a way to the West Indies, or to what they thought was China and India. And so some of the goods that they were buying were ending up in Europe. Now, a lot of these goods were coming from China, and China insisted that its goods be purchased in silver. Now, the Latin American mines were very rich in silver. So, anyone who was mining silver was going to be pretty wealthy. And so, we see Chile and Peru and Bolivia were very high on top of the silver and gold mining, even though they didn't find El Dorado. But so silver was mined there. But there's also other, transportation was huge. Again, think about the enslaved Africans who mostly went to Latin America. Um, Many big estates, huge estates, some of them controlled and farmed using slave labor. So there's quite a bit of wealth, and so you do actually see um, some levels of wealth that were not present in other colonies in Chile and Peru. Um, so we see different perhaps outcomes for the different areas of Latin America. Um, and so the question is, after independence, what is going to happen? What is going to happen to countries like Chile, Peru? Um, what is going to happen to their territory? Who is going to rule them? But so if you take a look at this map, you kind of see these losses that we are talking about. Um, Today's border of Mexico, so Mexico loses more than half of its territory because um, first, it loses Texas. Now, Texas initially declared independence, New Mexico was part of Mexico. Now, Alta California, as opposed to Baja California, was also part of Mexico. And again, this is ceded to the United States. So if you actually look at everything um, below, well, actually at the line of Sonora and the Gadsden Purchase, so that was the Gadsden Purchase. Mexico actually loses probably more territory to the United States than it kept. And of course, the South was part of Mexico, but then the United Provinces of Central America will break away, and this will become Guatemala, Honduras, and other countries. And so really within about 15 years, Mexico loses more than half of its territory, even as it has these Caudillos like Santa Ana. And so they really, we have to look at the Caudillo in the context of what they, even though they stepped into a vacuum of power, how should we think of their ultimate contributions to the countries they ruled? This is another view of everything that Mexico lost. And so a lot of sources will call it the Mexican Cession. And so again, you'll see that it begins below Oregon, Idaho, and Wyoming, parts of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, like really the biggest provinces or the biggest states in the West. So really, Mexico loses a lot of territory, even though now we don't allow people who used to live there to be. I often wonder what happened to those people. Did they automatically become Americans, maybe? Or are they shipped to? Um, but yeah, so we do see these territorial changes, not just in Mexico, but even in the South. Um, Now, Peru, so there have been wars. There were wars, sometimes between states, sometimes within states. So often there would be civil wars. Often there would be wars between um, different viceroyalties. Uh, but also, some of these wars take on the contours of today. So, a lot of wars today, well, quite a number of wars, are about resources. Um, and we actually see these wars going on even in the 1870s. So, for example, Bolivia, which did not have enough resources um, to dig up nitrate deposits. Now, we should put this conversation in broader context. In the During the Industrial Revolution, new resources are coming online. People are making new developments, new discoveries. And one of those discoveries was the use of nitrates for two things. One, explosives, and secondly, as fertilizers. Now, of course, fertilizers would improve the production of crops. And so Atacama Desert, nitrate deposits, Bolivia, but Bolivia didn't have the resources to exploit the deposits, and so they sell the concessions. Kind of like what you hear a lot of mining in some places done by certain companies. And so these concessions were sold to Chilean and British companies to mine the nitrates and produce fertilizer. But then Bolivia turns around and says, well, you know what, we are going to increase your cost for mining this nitrate. So increase in taxes. The Chileans and the British did not like it. They said it was illegal, and this actually boils into or explodes into a war. Now, this region actually fights for very interesting things. I think in 1968 there was a war between Ecuador and I forget if it's Nicaragua, and it's famously known as the Soccer Wars, fighting over World Cup qualifier match. But there were other, of course, there were other disputes that they were fighting over. But so Chile so Bolivia declared war on Chile because their merchants are not paying enough, and then Peru joins, and uh, Chile actually defeats Bolivia in Peru. Now, some people say this was the highest, this was the war with the highest casualty rate. Some estimates say about 90% of everyone who fought died. Um, and so it was pretty, um, yeah. But Chile defeats its two neighbors. This leads to some changes in the territory. So Bolivia actually used to have access to the sea, but the geography changes, so now it no longer has it no longer has access to the sea. Um, so this is actually generally referred to as the War of the Pacific. Um, so Bolivia and Bolivia and Peru are defeated by Chile. So there were attempts at trying to figure out why Bolivia lost. And part of the explanation was that Bolivia was really not a country. It wasn't united. It was, yeah, not, there was no unity in purpose. But you'll actually find this is true of quite a number of these regions. There was an absence of a national polity. So when you think about the comparison with the United States, you hear most people say, "I'm an American," and what does that necessarily mean? Um, Now, a lot of these colonial and post-colonial populations often see themselves as members of not the national polity, but the smaller units. And again, part of the reason is because these national polities are created. Um, so, for example, in the Andes Mountains, there were these native populations, Native American or Indian populations that did not necessarily identify with the Bolivian idea of a country. Um, and even when they actually paid any attention or into the coffers of the nation, a lot of it was coerced. So we see, for example, in Bolivia, there was a peace between the cities and the rural areas, but it's almost like the cities are the the highlands are paying tribute, and if you think about tributes, citizens kind of don't pay tribute. It's if you're controlled by other people, you pay tribute. They pay tribute in exchange for autonomy. So just leave us alone, take some money, just go and do. And so in Bolivia, we find a very weak central state, very little infrastructure, without a national economy. It's almost like, so there's the cities doing their thing, and then there's the highlands, and they're doing their thing, and didn't have a modern military. So how do you even call that necessarily a nation? It had external borders, but was it a nation? And so some think that this is really part of why Bolivia loses the war, whereas, for example, Chile had more consolidation because it's more homogeneous. Um, Now, speaking of Peru, after independence, the Peruvians banned tribute, Indian tribute. So, like, this is one country, you're not going to be paying tributes, you're members of the country. But again, even in Peru, there wasn't this history of nationhood. Again, the challenges to these countries is um, they become independent, not because they have a very specific vision for what the nation would be. It's more of what they do not like, which is colonialism. And it's almost like everybody had something they didn't like. The Indians wanted their autonomy. The maybe the mestizos wanted to be left alone by the colonial authorities. The enslaved, of course, wanted to be free from slavery. So it's almost like these interests were not necessarily aligned. And so even after the independence, there is no real effort to create a unified nation. But the one thing that we actually haven't really mentioned, I know I mentioned it in passing earlier on, is when you sort of think about race and, in the case of Latin America, class, so race, ethnicity, and social class. These were really sort of the driving factors, and they really determined who you are going to be, what your station in life was going to be. And so if you're an American Indian, you really don't have a stake in the nation that is constituted by mulattoes and mestizos. Um, so there were these different pockets of interests that never seemed to align. And so even when Peru becomes independent and finds resources, so um, guano exports. Guano is a fertilizer based on primarily on birds' droppings. Um, and so if you're familiar with Galapagos Island, Easter Island, that's off of Peru's coast. So Peru had quite a bit of success with exporting guano, uh, but then the proceeds that they get from exporting this fertilizer, the money goes to corruption. They don't build a military. They had good reasons, at least this. If you build a military and arm like black people, what's going to happen to the country? So this was one of, so if you think about the enemies of the state, you have black people who are not always emancipated. And then you have Indians, American Indians, whose territory has been taken. And so it's sort of like, do we really want to put them in the military and give them weapons? Um, and sort of the answer was maybe not. Um, and then, of course, you add the other challenges of development like civil war and corruption, especially corruption. So Roman Castilla, who was Ramon Castilla, rather, dominant Caudillo, and president for about 10 years, left he basically empties the treasury. Like the treasury is the nation's wealth, and so he leaves a very large foreign debt. And so when Peru then joins Bolivia to fight Chile, it's sort of like Peru has no money. So how are you going to fight if you have no money? And so again, if you think about what these Caudillos are doing, one might think they are pretty short-sighted by the policy preferences that they take. Like, you're going to empty the treasury and hoard the money. You're also not going to develop a military. How are you to fight enemies? And so if you sort of think about the Pacific War, um, in subsequent losses in territory, you see how, for example, Bolivia and Peru lose territory. Um, so Chile actually used to have like two different parts to it. And so it actually wins, and Bolivia used to have access to the ocean. But then during the Pacific War, Chile wins that territory, and so it cuts off Bolivia. So Bolivia actually has no access to the ocean, becomes landlocked. And that is not very helpful. Because if you're trying to export things like the fertilizers, the nitrates that Bolivia had, now you have to pay Chile to actually take your stuff to their, to their ports. But you can also see Bolivia losing territory to Paraguay. It loses territory up there to Brazil. And so now it has this kind of weird, smaller territory in there. So we see it lose quite a bit of territory. We see Bolivia lost its access to the sea. And so, actually, historically, a lot of Bolivians are very, very unhappy about the current map of their country because you used to have access to the ocean and now you do not. Um, but so we see these weaknesses Bolivia, Paraguay, um, especially Bolivia loses more than half of its territory, sort of like Mexico. And again, these Caudillos who are in charge, like Ramon Castilla, are partly. And so the story of Caudillos is often one of what were you doing when you're losing all of this territory, or what choices did you make that made your country be what it is now? And so in the in some analysis, the age of the Cordillo is often seen as a story of national disasters, whether it's Santa Anna's leg or Ramon Castilla's emptying the coffers and leaving uh, Peru unable to fight, or just bad governance. And there's quite a number of these. But so the age of the Cordillo or Cordelismo is one of national disasters. Um, States that were ruled in terror, that lived in fear of the dictators, these leaders, non-existent civil rights. So they are independent, but Cordillos actually trample on the civil rights. And even today, there's really not any country in Latin America that can be said to be a very strong democracy. Perhaps maybe Chile for a little while. But most of those countries have tittered on the brink of. You have the kinds of Jair Bolsonaro in power. You have the kinds of leaders like Juan Perón, who is famous for his military throwing people out of planes. So it's not a very um, democratic space. Inequality was rampant then and now. So if you think of places like Brazil and think of the of colorism, but also think of, for example, the trampling of the rights of Black Brazilians, who are actually the biggest population outside of the biggest Black population outside of Africa. So that inequality continues to. There was and continues to be an exodus of foreign and domestic capital, or the lack of investment um, in domestic industries. And so, if you actually look at Latin America, of course, every country has a number of industries, but there isn't an industry that you can say this is especially or noticeably Latin American. In fact, the closest that we have come to that is Brazil with the this. So Brazil has a thriving aircraft industry called Embraer, small jets. But other than that, the other places you might look at now, of course, they have mining and those kinds of concerns, but the only other industries that you might look at is maybe Argentina's beef exports. But this is not like they're making high tech things like superconductors or anything. So we see this exodus of foreign and domestic capital that leads to little economic growth and development. The prevalence of civil wars and military coups. Now, here we cannot absolve the United States because the United States was also very involved in Latin America. particularly if you consider the Cold War era. The US was very meddlesome in Latin America, in places like Guatemala, um, overthrowing actually democratically elected leaders, in places like Cuba, attempting to overthrow the Castros, places like El Salvador, I think. Um, so this it's not all on Latin America. This also, but also even American companies going into South America and taking over, for example, the United Fruit Company. But the story of Latin America is one of Caudilismo, of Caudillos, of inequality, terror, no civil rights, no development, civil wars, um, race inequalities. And so it just sounds like the, Latin America really didn't have any saving grace. Now, we could suggest that everything about Caudilismo is negative, but um, there was and there has been often um, elements that we can point to and say, well, this might be positives. So the capacity to command loyalties from different constituencies. Um, Unlike homogeneous nations, most Latin American nations were not homogeneous at all. In fact, they were probably some of the most stratified um, countries. And we are going to see in some of these countries, there were like 45 different designations of ethnicity. And it's not necessarily ethnicity like African, maybe German. It's sort of shades of color. Um, and so, how do you command loyalty from these different constituencies? How do you command loyalty from the Peninsulares, uh, from the Creoles, from the Mestizos, from the like what is the thing that binds these different groups together, these constituencies? How do you imagine the national unity project? And so Cordillos for a while were able to command loyalty of different constituencies if only these different constituencies had different interests. If you're enslaved, you want to be free. If you are Creole, you want the same rights as the Peninsulares. And so being able to navigate these different constituencies and interests was um, important. So because especially societal organization was around these, um, so even though there were affinities to different sort of constituencies. So, for example, you had these peninsulares who had affinity to Spain, but also saw themselves as maybe the upper class of the colonies. And again, even when independence came, it's not like they left; they were still there. So, think about how those attachments were local, but also often global. But so when you think about colonial elites, they sort of had these two different affinities, colonies, but also the social groups among them. Now, local peoples were more inclined to personal and local affinities. So if you're enslaved, you're probably more likely to be affiliated with your local sort of groups, whether it's church groups, community groups, and so on. And so this is what you're seeing deeply parochial, with loyalties first to their immediate communities and then to similar people. So if you're being discriminated the same, you sometimes might find affinity in those groups of discrimination. Um, And so when we sort of think about examples of this, we see, so the Spanish it's difficult to rule during colonialism. It was difficult to rule without any sort of organization, and so the colonial political bodies, the town councils, um, kind of represented local people, but also are venues and vehicles um, for state administration. And so when you sort of think about their dual function, the state comes in to the local communities through them, even today. But also they, because they functioned at the local level, they were deeply personal. And so um, you have this duality of the administrative, but again you see how they saw their role. So for example, the idea that I obey but I do not comply. um, so you can tell me what to do, I will obey, but that doesn't mean I'm going to do what you said I should do. And so this kind of is a relationship between the colonial administration and the local. And again, you if you even think about politics today, you will hear, you know, like uh, currently the whole thing between Texas and the federal government, like the government says, well, we're in charge of immigration, and Texas says, well, yeah, but we can close our borders and do those kinds of things. And so you sort of see this tension between the local and the national. And the national often didn't have a way to compel the local to do what the national wanted. So it becomes more challenging to administer. But also, manumissioned or emancipated, it's sort of like it required the passing of um, a couple of reconstruction amendments. And so there's sort of like a different way of thinking about indigenous that did not necessarily mean Native American. It's more like place, time, space, experiences, exclusion really defined you as indigenous. Um, so these kinds of experiences, and so again, the way to maybe think about this is if you think about the Maroons, and I'm certain you know of some of these Maroons, like the ex-slaves in Suriname, which is um, former Dutch colony, the Spanish speaking Catholic peasants in the Andes, so like high in the mountains, the excluded cowboys who were called gauchos in Argentina, or the ranchers in Mexico, often referred to as mestizos. So when you sort of think about their exclusion, they are on the fringes of society. Um, Now, even when they were, and so maybe a good comparative definition would be maybe the Southerners who didn't own slaves were poor during the period of slavery. So they kind of didn't necessarily, I guess they saw themselves as white and participated in the slavery experiment. But so this because of the race and class and other differences in Latin America, these sort of saw themselves as outcasts. You're not white, you're not European, you're not in the in group. And if you ever watched any old movies from Latin America, you probably have seen this. I'm thinking particularly of a movie like Zorro. You see all these people who tend the horses, people who are in the markets. Like these are not the upper classes. The upper classes are, like um, the Zorros. Those are so these rancheros, gauchos, and so on were sort of the communities. Um, Now it's not the case that they were necessarily very mm, what's the it's a good word. So it's sort of like they were a little rough cowboys. It's like you have this outdoorsy lifestyle, and you're hardy, you are, yeah. So cattle herders, riders, calf ropers, particularly in the Pampas in Argentina, when the Pampas were settled in establishing these huge um, ranches, and you're out there with the animals for months. Yeah, so you sort of think about them in their place in society, and they are on the outside, um, and so they included the peasants, Indians, and these. Now, so for them, who were their benefactors? And we'll see initially it was the king, now it's a Caudillo. And so some of their interests were especially, um, to defend their village autonomy or whatever societies that they lived in, thinking about communal land holding, thinking about, for example, those maroons. And now, if you actually think about, so many years later, we're actually seeing the decimation of these villages, like in Brazil, Amazonia. Um, yeah, particularly, so we actually see this run into their holding onto villages in the sort of historic narrative memory of their identity running into modernization. And so, particularly these new Caudillos and their allies and friends and everyone looked at these peasant communal lands as sort of being in the way. Think about maybe the Native Americans and sort of the American expansion. Like these communities were just really just hunting buffalo. Why couldn't they farm like that? So it's sort of this mentality of they're in the way of progress. You need to move them out. They are essentially backwards, nations without a coherent form, that the ownership of these territories or lands by villagers essentially stifled productivity. And so, again, for the villagers themselves, it's sort of like we are the bulwark against this encroachment by foreigners. And so you sort of see this contestation. But I